Good morning to Representative Stubbe or his staff. Global health and global human rights. In accordance with the House rules and with regulations, the host will mute all participants. Please keep yourself muted when not speaking. If you do not remember to mute yourself after speaking, the host will do so to limit background audio. A timekeeper will monitor the time for this hearing. For submission of documents during this hearing, please email hvac.repository@mail.house.gov. As a reminder, members must have their video on to be recognized. With that, Chair Bass, please count down from 5 and pause so the system recognizes your video and we are ready to begin.
1. The Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point. All members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous materials, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff contact the subcommittee staff. As a reminder to members, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you are not recognized by the Chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with HRes 8 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I will now recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we are holding a hearing entitled Combating Global Human Trafficking. Today, we are here to highlight and hear recommendations on what Congress can do to help combat human trafficking around the world and at home. We have a panel of expert witnesses who will give us an overview of the new TIP report, Trafficking in Persons. Tell us about challenges facing anti-trafficking efforts and how the COVID-19 pandemic is being exploited to benefit traffickers. As the global community looks to create a comprehensive strategy to address human trafficking, we must take a hard look at some of its root causes, including socioeconomic or political limitations that traffickers prey on. One common misperception of human trafficking is that it requires movement across borders, but anyone can be trafficked anywhere, including right here in our own backyard. So today I want to highlight and ask our experts specifically around the U.S. I will tell you that when I read the U.S. report, I know we grade ourselves as Tier 1, but with major limitations. And this report indicates a tremendous backsliding in the United States on multiple accounts. One, in terms of the situation at our border and people who were trafficked, clearly sexually trafficked or trafficked for labor, who were deported or not given an opportunity to even make their case, to cases here in the United States, domestic sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And so the last few years, we have had tremendous backsliding. I appreciate that the report documents that backsliding, but I think it also should raise questions about really the strength of Tier 1. And does our current Tier 1 ranking comply with the statutory provision of the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act Tier 1 status? So beyond this, I want our experts to expand and answer transparency when it comes to reporting on U.S. trafficking cases, U.S. investigative measures and prosecuting of labor trafficking cases, and how is our government increasing efforts to secure criminal restitution in all human trafficking cases. One area of backsliding that the report mentions in terms of the U.S. Is the prosecution and arrest of victims of trafficking, where it is clear that the victim was required to engage in illegal activity because of the person trafficking them, but yet they were still arrested. I know in many states, in my state and in my county, for example, in Los Angeles, especially when it comes to minors, we say a child, especially under the age of 16, cannot be a prostitute. That's inconsistent with the law, because if you can't legally consent to sex, how could you possibly be a prostitute? So we don't arrest children, but that is not the case, throughout the country. In some states, that is an issue. So I would like one of the speakers to address the backsliding in the United States and what we need to do to maintain our Tier 1 status, because one could raise a question as to whether or not we even deserve that ranking. So I'm co-leading, along with Representative Smith, the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act, and it's a bipartisan bill that we are going to work very hard as soon as the infrastructure bill is done. We are going to work very hard to get this bill on President Biden's desk. And when I wrap up, let me just say that I really want to acknowledge the role of the ranking member, Mr. Chris Smith, who really is the reason why we have the TIP report to begin with. And every year we do this report, and I wanted to, we didn't last year, right? Because last year we were all trying to figure out how to go on with life. But I just want to acknowledge his role in creating the TIP report to begin with. With that, Ranking Member, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Bass, for convening today's very important hearing on a topic that is near and dear to both of our hearts, combating sex and labor trafficking. And of course, we have so many other members of Congress, House and Senate, who believe as we do that this is one of the most heinous crimes. It's being committed in our backyard, and it's being committed all around the world. You and I have worked closely together on fighting the scourge of modern-day slavery with the original Frederick Douglass Trafficking Prevention and Protection Reauthorization Act of 2018. And what a great partnership that has been. And we got that bill passed and signed into law. And now we're working on the reauthorization, which we introduced together with Kenneth Morris, the great-great-grandson. We had a press conference with him that was just extraordinary, of Frederick Douglass. And he has helped us write this bill. As many of you know, tomorrow marks the 21st year anniversary of the signing of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or the TVPA. a bipartisan law that I authored to protect some of the most vulnerable people in our society, victims of human trafficking, and to hold traffickers and countries and groups and organizations, anyone who is complicit with these barbaric crimes, accountable for their egregious abuses of human rights. The TVPA's decisive condemnation of modern slavery reflects our society's recognition that human trafficking is fundamentally incompatible with the values of any nation that aspires towards the ideals of freedom, human rights, and the rule of law. The passage of the law marked a significant turning point to spark 2 decades of rapid expansion of U.S. efforts and partnerships, because countries all around the world now have laws that look a whole lot like ours. And as the Special Representative for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly on Human Trafficking, I work with each of the 57 countries, 57 including ours, that are trying to combat it in the European, the Moscow, in Russia, the stands, and then, but all of Eastern and Central and Western Europe. According to the 2021 Trafficking in Persons Report, global law enforcement reporting indicates an increase of about 2.5 times in identified victims of human trafficking worldwide. You got to identify them, to help them, to assist them, to rescue them. So there's a major effort underway, and that's between 2014 and 2020. However, prosecutions and convictions experienced an unsteady increase from 2014 to 2019, with a dip in 2020, likely from the pandemic. The 2021 U.S. Department of State's Trafficking in Persons Report confirms that the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in a diversion of resources to combat trafficking, while vulnerabilities increase in law enforcement and survivor support have significantly declined, leading to a dramatic increase in trafficking and even re-trafficking of victims who had found gainful employment, and then that employment disappeared and now are again vulnerable to the traffickers. Women and girls continue to be disproportionately affected by this crime, while 1 in 5 victims of commercial sexual exploitation is a child. Disturbingly, the circumstances surrounding the pandemic have led to increases in child vulnerability to online child sexual exploitation. To further combat this crime and to address these gaps, I'm so proud to say that Karen and I have introduced the reauthorization of the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act. We did it on September 3rd of this year, 2021, and we did it on the 183rd anniversary of Frederick Douglass's escape from slavery. The bill ramps up prevention and protection efforts against trafficking, particularly for children, a population that has experienced increased victimization, as I said, and as we all know, because of the pandemic and the isolation, where the predators are online grooming these children for exploitation and exploiting them online as well. But there's also a need to strengthen the international Megan's Law, and that's embedded in our bill as well, to require where feasible that countries participating in the visa waiver program reciprocate U.S. efforts and share their list of covered sex offenders to ensure that sex offenders returning to the U.S. after living in foreign countries register upon their return, and to require sex offenders to have passport identifiers even if they move or reside outside the U.S. The bill goes further to create the protection of confidentiality for survivors and their families. I would note parenthetically that the Angel Watch program and the International Megan's Law is what that is all about. Reports that over 6,000 convicted child sex offenders have been denied entry, have been made inadmissible into other nations as a result of the International Megan's Law, and about 15, almost 16,000 have been notified. So taking the secrecy out of these child sex tourism trips is already resulting in protections for children, and so hopefully that number increases, particularly as people travel more. It's only been in effect for a few years. We expect travel to spike as COVID dissipates. Throughout these 21 years, we have seen a growth in best practices, more victim-centered, trauma-informed, and survivor-informed approaches. Our Frederick Douglass bill, Karen and I's, is also survivor-informed and adds these approaches while removing the sunset on the survivor-led U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, thereby making it a permanent part of the U.S. government's commitment to survivor-informed policy. In keeping with the legacy of Frederick Douglass, our bill also focuses very, very profoundly on education, including scholarships named after Frederick Douglass. educating and training children, adults, parents, teachers, and law enforcement, healthcare professionals, and social service providers to identify and respond to the crime while also caring for the victim are key parts of the bill. Situational awareness, so that our young people in an age-appropriate manner will know what it looks like before they become victimized themselves. As Frederick Douglass's great-great-grandson, Kenneth Morris, once said about the importance of education, he said, "Knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave." Mr. Morris also made very incisive remarks at our press conference that it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men and women. Frederick Douglass himself escaped slavery when he was 20 and spent his entire life working to abolish slavery, and then after emancipation to ending the Jim Crow laws while struggling for full equality for African Americans. As we all know, he was a gifted orator. I read one of his books, autobiography, author, editor, statesman, and as I pointed out at our press conference, he was a Republican. The Frederick Douglass Trafficking and Victims Protection Act further incorporates anti-trafficking activities into foreign assistance programs, priorities and efforts at USAID, in project designs and monitoring and evaluation, and ensures programming in age-appropriate, linguistically accessible, culturally responsive, and survivor and trauma-informed. It also amends the Foreign Assistance Act to include effective counter-trafficking in persons policies and programs that ensures provisions do not contribute to increasing human trafficking, especially where there are natural and man-made disasters. It does also improve the minimum standards for the TIP report, which is a focus of today's hearing. This bill clarifies the language for countries bouncing between Tier 2 and watch list, Tier 2 watch list and Tier 3, and back again, and modifies minimum standards to include the purchase of commercial sex, reducing sex tourism. Our bill also tries to ensure that entities that are complicit in trafficking are always held accountable and are sanctioned by the United States government through the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. It requires that U.S. executive directors at each multilateral development bank vote against any Tier 3 country projects that do not include counter-trafficking strategies, assessments, and mitigation efforts. There's so much more to this bill, and without objection, I would ask that my full statement be made a part of the record, because I have much more to go, but I'd rather that we just get to the hearing and to the witnesses. But I would point out, these hearings annually and even twice a year, sometimes 3 times a year, on TIP report, both before when it happens as well as after the fact, I think help, it's good that the administration, whether it be Bush first, then, of course, Obama, and then Trump, and now President Biden, that they hear from us. We're a good sounding board. We do have our ears to the ground, and there have been many times in each administration where there was conflict within the regional bureaus, the TIP office, saying, oh, don't put them on, don't put Malaysia on. Remember that hearing we had in 2015? Malaysia, again, was one of those that were artificially upgraded. And what does that say to Thailand and all the others in that region especially? We got to be absolutely honest, speak truth to power. How we sanction Part 2 of our TVPA, is really discretionary at the administration's call, but they should not be in any way doctoring the documents. So we need to have it absolutely correct to the best of our ability. So thank you, Karen, for having this hearing.
Absolutely, and I appreciate that quote from Frederick Douglass, knowledge makes a person unfit to be a slave. In fact, during the 250 years of enslavement in the United States, it was illegal to teach anybody that was enslaved to read, and I think one of the fundamental differences when we talk about modern-day slavery versus what happened here and what happened throughout the Americas is that slavery was actually a legal institution, a fundamental part of our economy. And in the Emancipation Hall, there is a statue dedicated to Frederick Douglass and also a monument dedicated to the enslaved Americans who literally built the Capitol. The United States government rented enslaved Americans from plantations surrounding the Capitol to get the building built. So I think it's important that we make a distinction between what happened in the past and what is happening today. With that, I want to introduce our panelists, and then I will have to exit and turn the hearing over to our vice chair, Representative Ilhan Omar, as I have a markup in another committee. So we appreciate for the witnesses, all of you being here today, and look forward to your testimony. And let me remind the witnesses that your written statements will appear in the hearing record, and under Committee Rule 6, each witness should limit their oral presentation to a brief summary of their written statement, and you'll see the clock, which I believe that you can see, for 5 minutes, and know that you'll have opportunities to speak in the Q&A. Alex Thier is the CEO of the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, a multi-donor fund working to eradicate forced labor and human trafficking around the world. Alex was appointed by President Obama as the Chief of Policy, Planning, and Learning at USAID, where he served from 2010 to 2015, and he was the Executive Director of the Overseas Development Institute, a think tank in London focused on economic development, climate, and conflict. Mrs. Catherine Chen, you want to run for Congress? She is the CEO of Polaris, a leading anti-trafficking organization in the U.S. She is a veteran anti-trafficking strategist who has spent nearly 2 decades building innovative social justice programs to address the systemic failures and inequities that are at the root of sex and labor trafficking. Previously, as Polaris's Chief Program Officer, she spearheaded their 10-year vision for reducing and preventing trafficking at the magnitude of the problem. Prior to Polaris, she spent 7 years at Humanity United and led the Foundation's Human Trafficking and Labor Mitigation team as the Director of Investments. Catherine brings a deep commitment to racial and gender justice as a first-generation Chinese American and economic equity, and has a long track record of building up leaders who have lived experience. Mrs. Evelyn Chumbow is a survivor of child labor trafficking turned anti-trafficking activist and public speaker who focuses her life's work on ending modern-day slavery. Today, she works tirelessly to raise awareness in communities and to create employment opportunities for trafficking survivors. She currently serves on the board of directors for the Human Trafficking Legal Center and Free the Slaves. She has been invited to brief government agencies about human trafficking from a survivor's perspective, including the Department of Homeland Security, FBI, State Department, and the Department of Justice. Mr. Peter Williams serves as the International Justice Mission's principal advisor on modern slavery. He is responsible for the Centers of Excellence in Addressing Slavery, developing globally applicable best practices from extensive program experience worldwide. Most recently, he has served as the country director in Cambodia, where he led the development of the new program to address cross-border labor trafficking within recruiting corridors in the greater Mekong subregion, leading to the conviction of more than 30 traffickers in 3 years. He's also served as the field office director in India, where he developed a team of lawyers, social workers, investigators, and advocacy professionals to expand counter-bonded labor programming in the region. I want to welcome our witnesses, and at this point, I will turn the gavel over to Representative Omar. Okay, see you later. You want to talk?
I see. We will start with Mr. Thier.
Thank you. I'm Alex Thier, the CEO of the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, and I'd like to thank Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and the members of the subcommittee for providing us with this opportunity. Your leadership is essential, and I'm proud to be here with you and these other terrific leaders beside me today. As we meet here, the global fight to end modern slavery, human trafficking, and forced labor stands at a crossroads. In one direction, we face a global crisis. Over 40 million people living in conditions of modern slavery, deprived of their fundamental rights, dignities, and freedoms. More than 70% are women and girls, a quarter children. And despite significant commitments and investments, I come before you today with a stark truth. The number of people living in modern slavery is rising, not falling. Pandemic, climate change, corruption, rising authoritarianism all contribute. Despite being illegal everywhere, modern-day slavery persists almost everywhere. It happens on construction sites and in factories, on farms, fishing boats, and private homes. Tens of billions of dollars worth of everyday goods that make up our diets and daily routines, from coffee to chocolate to cell phones to the clothes we wear, are tainted with forced labor. It persists because millions of people, due to poverty, conflict, or inequality, lack viable alternatives. It persists because it is profitable, producing an estimated $150 billion annually to organized crime and traffickers, fueling corruption and the breakdown of rule of law. Yet, despite these terrible trends, I am also here to say that there is hope. For in the other direction at this crossroads, we see the potential for serious progress. We have evidence that we can break the cycles of vulnerability, profit, and impunity that perpetuate human trafficking. So what does progress look like? The Global Fund to End Modern Slavery is charting a new course. U.S. investment in 2017, matched by the UK and other governments, private sector partners, and foundations, has allowed us to demonstrate what significant progress can look like in a few short years. In the Philippines, for example, millions of women leave every year looking for decent work as domestic workers and in hospitality. Of these, tens of thousands find themselves in bondage, in debt, unpaid, abused in homes, and forced into brothels. Our integrated efforts there have supported legal reform, have helped victims and survivors seek justice against their perpetrators, including a landmark case where 8 traffickers were convicted in a Bahraini court and imprisoned. Through this work, we have helped thousands avoid debt bondage and save millions of dollars in fees that they can provide to their homes and families. This effort demonstrates what an integrated, systems-wide approach can achieve. Our work in Vietnam, supporting the first ever reintegration of survivors of sex trafficking near China's borders, was recently highlighted in the U.S. State Department's 2021 TIP Trafficking in Persons report. We have also created an award-winning supply chain tracing tool to protect vulnerable workers in global supply chains and to help both governments and companies identify high-risk factories. We are also working to de-anonymize cryptocurrency transactions to provide identifying information to law enforcement about rising online sexual exploitation. So even as the incidence of modern slavery is rising globally, I believe that there is a powerful set of trends, if harnessed, that could produce significant progress. So we have to ask ourselves, what must be done now, today, to create the virtuous cycle that will result in breakthrough progress in the next few years? We've spelled out 7 recommendations in detail in my written testimony, but let me just highlight a few with the remaining minute I have. Our first recommendation is that we must seize the opportunity for renewed U.S. and global leadership amidst rapid changes. U.S. leadership at home and abroad is critically needed to galvanize the world to a new level of ambition and action in the global fight. And the U.S. Congress, as we've already heard, has a critical opportunity to act, to reauthorize the program to end modern slavery, and to authorize future direct participation by the U.S. government in the Global Fund. Second, we need a coherent global strategy on human trafficking to produce real breakthroughs by 2030. The scale of this challenge requires comprehensive long-term strategy with broad support, burden sharing, and measurable and achievable goals. Third, we must increase support for survivors and survivor leadership. GFEMS believes that this is essential in the fight against modern slavery, that survivors are engaged as leaders and experts at every level of this endeavor. Fourth, the G7 has made new commitments by its leadership to eradicate forced labor from supply chains. We must hold those leaders to account to follow through. I know that I'm out of time now, so I'll hopefully speak about the other recommendations that we have later in the hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Thier. Now we'll hear from Ms. Chen.
Chair Bass, Vice Chair Omar, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Your leadership today and over the last 2 decades is critical to preventing and responding to sex and labor trafficking in the United States and around the world. I want to particularly thank Chair Bass and Ranking Member Smith for your continued bipartisan commitment to reauthorizing the landmark Trafficking Victims Protection Act. I'm the CEO of Polaris. Polaris's mission is to eradicate human trafficking and restore freedom to survivors. We do this in 2 main ways. We provide immediate response to victims and survivors through operation of the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, the National Human Trafficking Hotline connects victims and survivors with services and support to get help and stay safe, and is funded in part by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Additionally, we take the knowledge and insight gained over 20 years of operations to prevent human trafficking by making long-term structural change to the underlying systems that enable it to flourish. Our work is survivor-centered, justice and equity-driven, and technology-enabled. Informed by Polaris's data-driven expertise, I have several recommendations to accelerate the next phase of the U.S. government's efforts. These recommendations are described in detail in my written testimony, so I'm just going to focus on a few areas today. First, focus on prevention. The root causes of vulnerability are often consistent across borders. They include lack of safe and affordable places to live, lack of quality employment opportunities, policies and practices that purposefully discriminate or mistakenly marginalize certain groups, and much more. To truly meet the challenge of reducing human trafficking at the scale of the problem, we must address these root causes and prevent trafficking before it starts. The international community has long prioritized prevention through programs that tackle poverty, expand child protection, protect women's rights, fight corruption, and more. By contrast, the U.S. response has focused on a largely criminal justice approach to disrupt and deter trafficking. And while successful prosecutions are essential to ensure victims get justice, we now have an opportunity to broaden our definition of anti-trafficking programs to tackle the underlying vulnerabilities that enable it to happen in the first place. For instance, migrant workers experience specific vulnerabilities to trafficking that can be prevented. Holders of H-2A and B temporary work visas are disproportionately represented amongst victims of labor trafficking who contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Our data shows that during the first 6 months of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a 70% increase in labor trafficking victims with H-2A visas, and nearly 100% of victims reported fraud in recruitment. The most effective way to address the vulnerabilities faced by migrant workers is to implement reforms that protect them from exploitation before it happens. And there is consensus in the global business and human rights community. To end forced labor in supply chains, enforce a ban on recruitment fees charged to migrant workers. Congress can put an end to labor trafficking in the U.S. temporary visa system by regulating foreign labor recruitment, banning recruitment fees, and exploring options to allow migrant workers to leave abusive employers without fear of deportation or retaliation. Second, equip the global financial sector and prioritize financial inclusion for survivors. At its core, trafficking is a commercial enterprise. For this reason, the global financial sector is uniquely positioned to play a role. The U.S. anti-money laundering framework provides a path to decrease traffickers' profits while increasing accountability for trafficking and supporting survivors to receive restitution. Polaris partners with leading financial institutions like PayPal, and we've seen great engagement from the financial services industry in recent years. But for this approach to succeed, we need key government actors like the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network to be appropriately resourced. In January, Congress passed important anti-money laundering reforms and assigned a number of additional responsibilities to FinCEN. We urge Congress to realize the full potential of these reforms and increase FinCEN's budget by 50% in fiscal year 2022. Third, commit to survivor leadership. Since 2015, Polaris has directly connected more than 17,800 victims and survivors to the help they need through the National Human Trafficking Hotline. There are now tens of thousands of courageous survivors in the United States and around the world who can and should be driving the anti-trafficking field forward. If the movement is to meaningfully evolve and build on the work of the past 20 years, the vision, tenacity, and expertise of survivors are critical. That means proactively transforming the anti-trafficking field so that survivors lead the agenda and the organizations driving this movement. We must invest now to ensure the survivors are supported throughout their recovery and are fairly compensated for their expertise. The U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking is a presidentially appointed body of trafficking survivors who advise federal agencies. Last year, Congress passed a provision that allowed the Department of State to compensate council members, and Congress must now ensure that this provision is implemented. And finally, we urge Congress to work with the administration to ensure a strong, experienced nominee is appointed as ambassador at large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons as soon as possible.
Thank you. You all can submit your comments for the record as well. Now we'll hear from Ms. Chumbow.
Let's press talk. Nervous. Okay. Thank you and good morning. Chairman Bass, Vice Member Omar, Ranking Member Smith, and member of the subcommittee. I am honored to be here to testify about human trafficking. I am grateful for the invitation to speak about measures to combat human trafficking. You have probably heard that human trafficking can happen to anyone. That is true, but that is not the whole story. Trafficking happens when someone is vulnerable socially, economically, and racially. Human trafficking happens too often to immigrants and people of color. Africa are still being sold into modern-day slavery. For example, like places like Libya, not long ago, there were Africans that were being auctioned off. Trafficking used force, deception, coercion to prey upon the most vulnerable. That was true 400 years ago. It remains true today. We face a modern form of slavery. The fundamental difference between the illegal slave trade that operates today and the legal slave trade more than a century ago is the context. The state enforced chattel slavery before the civil rights. Today, it is a crime. Today, trickling is the trafficking tool. Deception is used to get people to travel voluntarily to America. They arrive with the hope and dream that they will be able to create better life for themselves and their family members. But once a person is away from their family and their culture, the support system that they discover that have been lied to. It happens every day. It happens every day at the airport all around the country. People come to this country with legal visa, but find out that they're not going to live their American dream. Instead, they are threatened, violence, and they're abused. And that's why I'm here today, because trafficking happened to me. Again, for me, it was a dream. I wanted to come to America. I wanted to marry Will Smith because in Cameroon, I was fascinated by so many different television shows, like The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, 90210 Cosby Show. So I thought America was just like those, TV shows that I saw. So when I was told that I was coming to America, I got excited. No kidding. I definitely wanted to marry Will Smith. That was my reason for coming to America. Never once did I think that I would come to America and become a victim of modern-day slavery, something that was abolished, in 1865. And it was sudden. My trafficker was a woman. I was trafficked from age 10 until 17. No school from age 10 until 17. I did not get to see my family members until age 27 when I reunite with them. And it happens to so many. And again, just like we stated, immigrants, I was an immigrant and I did came here illegally. But, regardless of all of that, I did manage to obtain my GED, got my bachelor's degree, and I am an employee at one of the firm, Baker McKenzie Law Firm, as a project assistant and also an advocate. So just like my colleagues have mentioned, I have 6 recommendations. And the number 1 recommendation is prevention. Prevention is very important. We still have to fight to talk about prevention because trafficking goes mostly on time, on notice. It happens next door, and trafficking is not only sex trafficking. It's labor and sex, and I'm a survivor of domestic servitude right here in Silver Spring, Maryland. And the number two is to invest in survivor trafficking. You know, we need to invest more on survivors. By doing so, when I mean invest, helping them get jobs. You know, try your best not to re-victimize them. You know, helping them to get a good education. I got an education, but if we could use some of that Freddie Douglass scholarship, Representative Smith, you know, I'll be getting my master's right now, you know? So, you know, so we need that, and it's a struggle for survivors, and I know I'm about to run out of time. I had 6, but you have it in my testimony. It's there in details, and I'm running out of time, so I won't talk much.
Thank you, and now we'll hear from Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Vice Chair Omar. Thank you, Chairwoman Bass and Congressman Smith. Thank you, Vice Chair Omar. Thank you, Chairwoman Bass and Congressman Smith, for your leadership on this issue. I particularly want to thank you for your work on the reauthorization of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act this year. International Justice Mission looks forward to working with you on the bill's passage. IJM has counter-trafficking programs in Latin America, Africa, Europe, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Having led IJM programs in South Asia and Southeast Asia for 10 years and overseen more than 100 trafficking cases, I've repeatedly been witness to the power of the US leadership on this issue, primarily through the tip reports and well-directed grants. And I extend my thanks to the government of the United States for its continued leadership in combating trafficking in persons. Let me set before you a vision of what is possible. In a case my team and I worked on in Cambodia a few years ago, 4 Cambodian farmers had been trafficked onto Thai fishing vessels and exploited in brutal conditions for many years. They'd then been detained in Indonesia as criminals and deported back to Cambodia. But when the men arrived home in Cambodia, things began to change. They were formally identified as victims of trafficking, triggering a raft of protective aftercare services which empowered the men to recover from their trauma and reintegrate into their communities. These protective services wrapped around the prosecution process. The men were supported to testify against their trafficker at trial in a northern Cambodian court. The judge believed their testimonies and convicted their trafficker. It was one of the first convictions in the region of a source-side trafficking recruiter. His conviction led to a run of subsequent cases that dismantled a trafficking ring that had been exploiting Cambodians for nearly a decade, thus preventing many future crimes from ever happening. Powerfully, the men told me after they had testified that this was the first time in their lives that someone in authority had believed them. When government systems respond as they should, word gets out. People begin to trust and use the system more. A virtuous cycle begins, a flywheel of survivor-centered protection, perpetrator accountability, and the prevention of future crimes. You see, the State Department's famous 3 Ps, protection, prosecution, and prevention, remain as vital today as they were when they were first devised. This story bears repeating. The world needs to see cases like this repeated time and time again, the 3 Ps in action, instead of these cases being the exception to the norm. As governments seek to build back stronger from COVID-19, there are 3 things the US government can lead on to help scale the most effective interventions in trafficking. First, encourage better data. It's unlikely these cases from Cambodia were reliably recorded or accounted for by the Cambodian government. Governments will never know how effective their responses are if they do not commit resources to accurate and transparent data capture. We would like to see this emphasized in future TIP reports. An assessment of each government's data will encourage a stronger report and, more importantly, a more informed government response. Second, continue to encourage this kind of public justice ownership that we saw in this case. Government-to-government partnerships like the Child Protection Compacts are excellent models that enable 3-way collaboration that includes real ownership from host public justice systems, partnership with civil society, and the sustainable scale-up of effective interventions. Third, take this opportunity to lead in technological solutions to trafficking. The simple power of video conferencing, now ubiquitous in our work lives, allows survivors to give evidence from the safety of their home countries. We've seen this used in Southeast Asia and recently in Romania, increasingly during the pandemic, but it's not done nearly enough. Greater investment in this simple measure would increase effective survivor-friendly prosecutions globally. Traffickers are using online platforms to sexually exploit young children, often for profit, and this form of trafficking has increased during COVID-19, as has already been shared. We must look to technology to prevent the sharing of child sexual abuse material online and to discourage this shocking form of abuse. As I close, my colleagues and I at IJM believe that those affected by trafficking deserve the best of what the world can offer. They deserve solutions that are proven to bring change and hope. But we do not need to speak for these survivors. They are speaking for themselves. And I acknowledge the statement of Ms. Chumbo this morning. And in closing, I commend to you the statement that we have submitted to this committee from the Global Survivor Network, which says, and I quote, "A system that will protect survivors is one that will benefit everyone in the community. Our goal should be to create a system where survivors have the ability to secure justice and protect themselves and their families from past, current, and future exploitation." Thank you.
Thank you all for your testimonies. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Williams, I do agree with you. We do have to listen to survivors. And it is really such an honor to hear from Ms. Chumbow. I wanted to give you some time to talk about an op-ed you co-wrote in June that I found really interesting about racism and the anti-trafficking movement. And I'm especially interested in the way those dynamics impact what we as policymakers hear about and work on. Could you tell us a little bit about your findings in that survey and the op-ed and what you think the implications are for policymakers here in the United States?
Thank you, Vice on my app. Yes. So that the survey that we did. So I've been in this movement for a long time. You know, after I got out of my situation and being in the movement, I realized that, you know, racism was such a big issue in the movement, and it's sometimes we go unnoticed. We don't talk about it, you know. And when people think of trafficking, most of the time they usually just think of sex trafficking. And if you look at images, when you type human trafficking on Google, you're mostly gonna see young, you know, white women that are blonde, you know, in chains, and it doesn't portray that trafficking is a diverse issue and affects, you know, people of color a lot. You know, it's never talked about. So doing this survey was something that was so powerful. My colleagues and I from the Human Trafficking Legal Center, I did the survey. I reached out to all the survivors that are in the movement, how they felt, and they did feel that you know, racism is a big issue in the movement. It's never going unnoticed, you know. And during the former administration, I just also noticed that when they were asked to talk about trafficking, they also brought up, you know, young white women, you know, that are blonde. And especially as African, it is, for me, I feel it is very hard for the world to understand that Africans are still being, you know, sold into slavery, that these issues are affecting them a lot. And I gave, in my testimony, I talked a little bit about how Africans were being auctioned in Libya and in the Middle East, and the world kind of turned it back on it. The world just shut down. Was it because they were Africans? Why? What was the reason? You know, and we also have to hold the African government accountable of taking responsibility for their citizens. As an African woman, I was very disappointed that my situation happened, and, you know, they didn't really handle the situation that it was supposed to. I came to the country illegally. I did not know. Again, like I mentioned, my goal was to marry Will Smith. You know, never once did I think that I will come to the U.S. and be a victim of modern-day slavery. And people of color are being affected every day, and it's going unnoticed, and it's something that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Really appreciate that, and I think it is important. Even, you know, the international cases that we do read about in Bahrain or the Emirates or Saudi Arabia, we might hear about the Filipinos or the Pakistanis, but we don't hear about the Ethiopian, the Somalian, the Sub-Saharan Africans that are being enslaved in domestic destitute. And so it is important that we really do understand that there is an element of racism and an element of recognizing certain people for what's happening to them and not. Mr. Thier, despite significant attention paid to transnational human trafficking, the UN Office on Drugs and Crimes Global Report on Trafficking Persons in 2020 found that globally most detected victims are citizens of the countries they are detected. How, if all, should anti-trafficking approaches differ when addressing trafficking that is contained in one foreign country as opposed to when it is transnational form of trafficking?
Thank you so much, Representative Omar. And
if you could be brief, that would be great.
Yes, absolutely. You know, I think that the point that you're making is fundamentally important, as several of the stories here have indicated. The work on law enforcement, the work on making sure that information is shared between agencies, that this is done both at the national level and at the subnational level is absolutely critical. We actually have a dramatically important and effective program working on combating sex trafficking in India with IJM that we are working on together. And the thing that we have found, the breakthrough that we have achieved, is by getting the local government, the local law enforcement, and the local community all working together on the same side. And that is something that can only be done by building trust, by having effective law enforcement, not ineffective law enforcement or harassing law enforcement, and by making sure that it is ultimately the communities where people are coming from that are actually the ones that are engaged ultimately in the solutions. It's not just about the prosecution that's critical, it's also about supporting those victims on a sustainable path out of slavery.
Thank you. I now recognize Ranking Member Smith for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me, all of your testimonies are outstanding. The recommendations are very, very helpful. Survivor and victim-based input and leadership couldn't be more properly stated. I think we've, you know, when we were having trouble with the original Trafficking Victims Protection Act, pardon me, in the 1990s, and there was a lot of opposition to it, more indifference than opposition, I brought over two women that I had met in St. Petersburg, Russia, along with my wife, who Miramed had saved, an NGO, and they told their stories, and that was when we started to see a pivot, where people were saying this is a problem, and these women talked about how they had been raped every single day, night after night, several times a night. And you could have heard a pin drop when they presented their testimony. Gary Haugen testified in 1990, let me get this right, September 14th, and helped us write the bill, and I'm always appreciative for his work. He came at one of our hearings and brought pictures of young girls from India who had been, sadly, enslaved. And before the attempt could be made to rescue them, the police were tipped off and moved to another location. So one of the important parts about TIP in holding governments to account is that wherever that, whether it be law enforcement or judges or politicians, you name it, they need to be sanctioned. And that's why if we bring in Global Magnitsky more effectively into this effort, we will hold police chiefs and others to account. Because I remember when these young girls came up out of a cellar and all their eyes were adjusting to the light, and it was heartbreaking beyond words to see how they were about to be further exploited. And of course, the police helped to end a rescue, and it was just heartbreaking. You know, with regards to Africa, I've been all over Africa in shelters, several in Nigeria, and I remember going to Rome. Sister Eugenia has a shelter there, and there were a number of Nigerian women and young girls that were there. And one particular woman named Elizabeth told her story as I sat there, again, near tears, how she had been trafficked for 5 years, sex trafficked. She was on the streets in Rome before Sister Eugenia came and rescued her with her van. And she had a little kid, 2 years old, running around, 2.5 maybe. She goes, "That baby saved my life." You know, I was ready to commit suicide, except now I had. So it just underscored the brokenness, and for her, it was a faith journey that helped her get over all of this, and certainly the psychological and other helps that she got from that shelter. So shelters continue to be extremely important. We need more of them. But just a couple of very quick questions, if I could. And that is, you know, Mr. Thier, you talked about Vietnam. I've been one of those, you know, the first conviction under the TVPA was out of Daiwa in American Samoa. And the Vietnamese government never, because they are the complicit in those crimes of forced labor, they've never come through with acknowledgement, but more importantly, with assistance. You know, Mr. Williams, you talked about, and I appreciate you reminding everybody of this, of the right of private action that we put into the 2003 Act. I wrote the 2003 Act, the reauthorization, and everything we missed in the original one, we tried to put in there, and in the 05 Act. But the idea of getting that tax-free, if there is a successful, maybe you can elaborate on that, because I think it's so important that the right of private action empowers victims to get into court and to sue the person that has, or persons, or the group that have so horribly mistreated them. I know I don't have a whole lot of time, but I just, on China, you know, Xinjiang continues to be, I love the way the State Department put it, in Xinjiang, the government is the trafficker, and what they're doing to Uyghur Muslims is genocide. And it's part of that genocide is concentration camps where they make goods for export. Parenthetically, Frank Wolf and I, back in right after Tiananmen Square, got into Beijing prison number 1, where they were making jelly shoes and socks for export. How we get in there is still bewildering to me and to him, but we asked for it, we got in. We took those exports and we got, you know, what they're exporting samples, and there was a customs action taken, and that gulag actually closed down. But they continue, the Chinese, all across China, to utilize forced labor, but nowhere is it more barbaric than against the Muslim Uyghurs. What further should we be doing on that? And, you know, and finally, I know, again, there's not much time here, but we need a tip ambassador at large. We need that person, no matter who she or he turns out to be, as soon as possible. And I say that for the leadership, but also for the leadership inside the building. You know, every tip ambassador has told me here at hearings, as well as privately, and they've told you as well, that fighting those interests, ambassadors and others who don't want their country put on the tip report as a Tier 3 country so we need a very strong individual to take up that effort, and we need it now. So I know if I could get a little bit further to get some answers to those questions. I appreciate that. Thank you. Vietnam.
Maybe I can just maybe I can just briefly respond to the point about China and more broadly. We've been involved with a large number of anti-slavery, anti-trafficking organizations in the last 6 months, advocating strongly for the G7 to take action against forced labor, which would have certainly affect the situation in Xinjiang as well as globally. And I think that there is a really important movement afoot. Europe right now is considering creating a tariff ban like the US has to block goods. They're considering something called mandatory human rights due diligence, which would put an emphasis on companies having to know whether there is forced labor in their supply chain, whether it comes from Vietnam or China or wherever it's coming from. They have an obligation to stop it. I believe that a lot of the genesis of these ideas, of course, came from the U.S., the legislation that you have passed, that others have passed, that governments, bipartisan governments, have begun to enforce. And I believe what's needed now is that the U.S. needs to, first of all, help to fulfill these commitments. Just passing the laws, whether it's in the U.S. or in Europe, is the start of the solution. It's not the end of it. We need to have enforcement regimes, information sharing, so that when we ban a Malaysian glove manufacturer, as we did the other day, that the UK also has access to that information so that they can do the same, because they rely on those gloves as well. We need to share that information. We also need to support our partners. We want Bangladesh to succeed. We want Kenya to succeed. We don't want them to fail as a result of enforcement. We want them to come up to standard. And that means we have to support them to become better at enforcing their own laws, at having the information that we have access to, and making sure that the private sector is also doing its part to detect the forced labor so that we can all make sure that it is eradicated.
Thank you, Mr. Thier. The gentleman is out of time. We will do, hopefully, a second round of questioning. I now recognize Mr. Phillips of Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and heartfelt gratitude to all of our witnesses today to discuss this terribly important topic. I think it's fair to say that human trafficking is analogous to modern-day slavery, and it represents the very worst of humanity all around the world. Nobody, absolutely nobody, should be forced to enter or remain in unsafe situations against their will, period. That's exactly why I fought for an amendment to the VAWA that was passed by the House. My amendment would ensure that no one is forced to stay in a relationship, an abusive relationship, because of their immigration status. Instead, victims of domestic abuse could apply for independent immigration status and give them the opportunity to escape their abusive arrangements and relationships, unlike so many of the trafficking victims that we've heard about today. So my question to you, Ms. Chen, is what other legislative tools can Congress pursue and consider to help protect current and potential trafficking victims and survivors around the world?
Thank you, Congressman. I think that there are several areas that could be of interest to this committee as well as to the larger Congress. First of all, I think when you're talking about the control that abusers have had over victims, I think that there is a really important parallel to the way that labor trafficking victims are treated in the United States. I've raised in my testimony, as well as in the written testimony, the issue of the temporary guest worker visa in the United States. What we have seen is that a huge proportion of victims who are labor trafficking victims coming into the U.S. are coming from Central America and Mexico, and that the overwhelming majority, when they do come in on a temporary guest worker visa, are bound to the control of their employer. So if they try to leave an abusive employer, they lose their immigration status. And that is an area that we strongly hope that Congress will focus on, is to look at whether or not there are new and creative ways for workers to not be tied to their employers, and also so that any employer that is using the threat of immigration deportation as a mechanism for control of a worker is held to account for that. The other area that we continue to want to hope to see happen is ongoing funding for the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. Because truly to end labor trafficking of migrant workers and labor trafficking of anyone in the United States, it's a three-pronged approach. We need to be changing the way that people are recruited. We need to make sure that recruitment fees are banned and labor recruiters are regulated. We need to make sure that enforcement is actually funded. The U.S. Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division is not sufficiently funded to be able to enforce labor violations. And so often when people are in trafficking situations, their labor trafficking situation showed up first as a wage and hour violation. And lastly, like I said, we need to remove employer control over workers. Overwhelmingly, what we see with labor trafficking victims is that when we examine the data from the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline, The way that workers are forced, defrauded, and coerced is through threats of immigration enforcement, even though they are here legally on legal working visas. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chen. Very helpful, and appreciate that. Mr. Thier, a question for you. We know that experts have identified the lack of rule of law and political oppression and corruption as common precipitators of human trafficking around the world. As a member of the Counter Kleptocracy Caucus, I'm working with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to tackle these very kinds of practices worldwide. So my question is, what tools are most effective in your estimation to address the root causes of human trafficking and try to reduce its prevalence around the world?
There's no question that it's corruption, profit are drivers of the persistence of modern slavery and human trafficking. And it is ultimately, in our experience, political will, working directly with those authorities, as well as providing the public pressure that's necessary that will get people to act. Where we have found success has almost always been when we have been able to bring together a coalition of government actors, constituencies for reform, those who are pressing to make change, together with communities that are affected, together with survivors, together with the private sector. It is that coming together of people that builds pressure, that builds understanding, and that can ultimately make progress. There's not a silver bullet to the problem of corruption, unfortunately, but I think that we've demonstrated the ability to change laws, to get those laws enforced, and to have companies move in the right direction by bringing those forces all together.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you.
We now recognize Mr. Malinowski of New Jersey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. Ms. Chen, I wanted to engage you a bit on why an anti-trafficking organization is so interested in seeing an increase in the budget of an obscure agency of the Treasury Department, namely FinCEN. I completely agree with you, but I'd like to try to get into a little bit greater depth on that. And I guess to begin with, what we were talking about there is that this is a money-making enterprise, human trafficking, and that and the traffickers then need to hide the profits of this illicit activity. One of the ways in which they do so is through shell companies. Is that correct?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, that's absolutely correct. For about 2 years now, Polaris has been working very closely with PayPal to develop a financial intelligence unit. And what we've been able to do is to take the data from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, combine it with open source information, and figure out how human trafficking is showing up in bank records. And this is vitally important because from our perspective, if there is additional tools that don't require survivors to have to testify in front of courts and face their traffickers in court, it is a more survivor-centered way of pursuing justice. The data doesn't lie, and when there are anti-money laundering investigations that show that there has been trafficking, that is another tool that is useful for everyone. Ultimately, it also changes the dynamic of how criminal justice is enforced because it takes money laundering investigations take the burden off of street-level policing and start to look at the data and look at the pathways and look at the money flows that are actually happening. For that reason, what we've seen is that the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, which sits inside of Treasury, is a vital partner. It's a vital partner for all forms of anti-money laundering enforcement. It's a vital partner as cryptocurrency becomes the currency of du jour. And being able to make sure that, that money laundering is not continued to be used, making sure that human trafficking is not continuing to be a high profit and low risk enterprise, that this really strikes at the core. And earlier in 2021, through the National Defense Authorization Act, Congress asked for FinCEN to have additional responsibilities, specifically around creating and maintaining a new national beneficial ownership database, and establishing national anti-money laundering priorities, of which in June FinCEN said human trafficking was one priority. And so we really just want to make sure that the agency itself has the kind of funding that it needs. Treasury has asked for a 50% increase in FinCEN's budget for fiscal year 2022, and that's because I think at last count we've seen the number of reports going into FinCEN that flag suspicious activity go up by about 4,000%, and funding has not followed. And so there's a really clear need for FinCEN's capacity to grow. And so yes, I agree it's obscure, but I think for us it is an essential partner in making sure that trafficking cannot continue to be high profit.
Yeah, it's super important, and we gave them the new responsibility of being able to crack down on shell companies used for illicit activity. We need to give them the resources to do it. But there's, I think, more that needs to be done. I mean, we saw, for example, in the latest Pandora Papers release, that those engaged in illicit activity, including human trafficking, have now moved away from the regular banking system and are using real estate investments, the help of law firms, accounting firms, to try to set up these vehicles, whether it's a shell company or a trust or other means of hiding their assets. We have a bipartisan bill, the Enablers Act, that would impose due diligence requirements on those kinds of entities. Is that something based on your research that would be helpful in the fight against human trafficking?
Yes, absolutely. And I know we're out of time, so I really look forward to learning more about the legislation that you're working on, and we would love to be part of it.
Fantastic. We'll be in touch. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Jacobs of California for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Vice Chair, and thank you all for being here. And Ms. Chumbo, thank you for telling your story and continuing to advocate. You shouldn't have to keep telling your story over and over again for us to do something, but I'm very grateful that you're doing it. And I'm also very grateful that so many of you have talked about how to make sure we have a comprehensive approach to this issue and look at the root causes. I wanted to get at kind of a particular group that we know is vulnerable, and that is refugees, often coming from instability or lack of opportunity to a new environment without strong ties, tend to be vulnerable to labor exploitation and sexual exploitation. So for any of you, but Ms. Chen, I was hoping you could start, how can we make sure refugee programs in both camps and other settings are better positioned to provide the necessary services to prevent exploitation? How do we make sure we're providing these services and resources in an empowering way? And also making sure that the very people in charge of providing those services are not participating in the exploitation.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I mean, I think that the way to protect recently arrived refugees is the same way that we protect anyone who's recently arrived in the United States. So often people who are just coming here are not yet connected to support services, may not be super clear about what laws apply to them, what rules, what rights they have available. And so I would certainly start with a fundamental thing, which is economic equity, and making sure that people who come to the United States as refugees have the right to work. And I would just really kind of start and stop there. I think that there are many services that can be strengthened, of course, but the fundamental thing is that people need the ability to participate meaningfully, legally, and fully in the economy.
Thank you. Anyone else have thoughts on refugees? Ms. Chumbo?
Thank you. Thank you. I would just like to add that, educating them again, because if we don't know our right as a refugee, if you don't understand, even if you're in that camp, it is good to have someone that can teach you about your right. Because knowing your right, it helps you to understand what you're going to face. Especially when it comes for, I will also add that we need to talk to embassies to educate people that are coming into the country to understand their rights. You know, for my case, if I knew what I was going to face here, I don't think I would have wanted it to come. And all these embassies need to educate people on that issue. And we also, I think I mentioned earlier, we also need to start holding other country government accountable for their citizens. You know, they need to help educate their citizens about, you know, the issue of human trafficking. That will also help with the TIP report. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Williams?
Only to add, globally, obviously, the issue of trafficking can mirror the migration and flow of people and refugees as well. And what's important is actually cross-border collaboration and mechanisms between countries to support when things do go wrong, but provide that really collaborative joint investigations, joint responses across borders. The work of International Organization for Migration, IOM, has been phenomenal in this area, and IJM's partnered with them globally. But to really understand that actually that dynamic flow of people is challenging for states to address because of state sovereignty, because of borders. And so there can be networks that arise to combat networks. And so looking to civil society, looking to international organizations to help governments to join up their efforts together is a strong response to trafficking within the refugee population.
I'll just add quickly to reinforce what my colleagues said, and particularly Evelyn's statement. 3 things. Digital identity. It is absolutely fundamentally that people on the move have the ability to identify who they are and to get access to services and everything as a result of that. The second is access to finance and financial inclusion. We find with the huge numbers of migrants and refugee populations that we work with, that when people have access to banking, access to finance, it enables them both stronger connectivity, often back home, but also to be able to participate. And the third one, and it's absolutely essential, and this is what Evelyn was saying, is education, is empowering people who are on the move to understand their rights, to understand the decisions that they're making, to help their parents and their families understand the decisions that they're making. One of our most successful programs in this regard is working with a large-scale population of Bangladeshi migrants and refugees who are leaving and going to the area. And what we have found that digital inclusion, provision of information, is enabling them to make much better and stronger choices for themselves, and ultimately, if they have to, access back to law enforcement and government if they get in trouble.
Thank you. I think my time has expired, so I will yield back.
Thank you. I think we'll do a second round of questions. Thank you all for your patience. I would like to ask, Chen, I think you touched on this a little bit in your testimony. Obviously, there's a significant debate around whether the prohibition of sex work helps or hurts victims of human trafficking. One of the significant worries that is that it makes criminals out of victims and preventing government regulation that could help prevent trafficking. So I just wanted to see if you would elaborate a little bit more. Do you support or oppose prohibition, and why? And do you think the United States should be pushing prohibition in other countries?
Thank you, Vice Chair Omar. I'm going to be honest that this is a super fraught area in the U.S. anti-trafficking movement and also globally. And I think it's fraught not only because it is people on all sides and all dimensions of the spectrum that feel very strongly about the issue, but also because people who have experienced prostitution and sexual exploitation are not themselves uniformly in support of one position or another. Polaris takes the view of support for what we call partial decriminalization. We think that there is a set of impacts that the criminal justice system often has had on survivors who are criminalized as part of their victimization. We have heard from hundreds of trafficking survivors who have experienced limitations to being able to access social services as a result of having interacted with the criminal justice system. However, we've also heard from hundreds of trafficking survivors who say that they want the people who have purchased their services for sex to be held accountable for the exploitation they have faced, and that they see no daylight between the conversations about Me Too and the rising conversations about holding people accountable for sexual assault with this conversation as one conversation. And so I think for us, we are perpetually kind of stuck in this challenging position of very much wanting to be in solidarity with trafficking survivors on what it is that they want to see, and at the same time recognize that folks are not yet necessarily seeing it from a consistent and uniform perspective, and may not, right? Because I think everyone's exploitation experience is really different. The last thing that I'll say is, and because you asked the question of Ms. Chumbo about the intersection between racial justice and trafficking, is that we also know that overwhelmingly people who are criminalized for sex trafficking are often Black women and girls who are in situations of sexual exploitation, and that is something that has to be addressed in the United States.
And I do wonder, maybe if you would go a little farther, do you think that there is more focus and maybe that leads to more exploitation on the ones that are exploited and criminalizing them, rather than there being a penalty of those that are benefiting from that exploitation, say the Johns or the ones that are doing the trafficking?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is, of course, speaking about the U.S. context, right? I think that we have had a focus on criminal justice sort of productivity when it comes to anti-trafficking enforcement. So we've been equipping vice units and intelligence units for some time now to be able to identify trafficking situations and enforce those trafficking situations. I would say about even back to like a decade ago, the method by which people often tried to prosecute traffickers was to arrest trafficking victims so that they could work with them to pursue cases. And so I think that that's one of the places where certainly Polaris has been taking a lead. We're also very interested in seeing criminal record relief for trafficking victims who've already been charged.
Wonderful, thank you. Mr. Thier, in your view, which governments are failing to combat human trafficking? Do you believe that the Tier 3 ranking on the State Department's annual trafficking in persons report accurately reflects these countries? Do you find that foreign governments' failure to combat human trafficking more often relates to lack of capacity or insufficient political will and prioritization? And how effective is the State Department's ranking process in combating anti-trafficking efforts? It's a lot of questions, but.
No, it's a great list of questions. And first of all, given the prevalence of human trafficking and modern slavery in the world, it's almost all of them, right? We don't have enough time to list the countries that aren't doing enough, including our own. This is a global crisis, and we do need to step up global action on these issues. Maybe I'll just answer the question by speaking to one specific example, which I think is very powerful, and that's of Malaysia, because it was mentioned before in this hearing. Malaysia was downgraded to Tier 3 this year. And we have seen multiple, I believe, 4 enforcement actions by the U.S. government preventing goods from Malaysia coming in. One as recently as this week, blocking, in a pandemic, mind you, which I think is a great sign of political will, in a pandemic, blocking medical gloves, which also happened last year. And the reason that I cite this example is because, first of all, I think that the question of Malaysia, as was mentioned, has been fraught. Second, I am certain as we expand our work now into Malaysia, I am certain that this ranking and that the enforcement actions that the U.S. government has taken are raising global awareness of the problem, are putting pressure specifically on the government of Malaysia and in private sector organizations in Malaysia. In other words, it's working. The pressure is working, the recognition is working, and that is causing us and other entities in the Malaysian government and, of course, in the private sector to actually take action. So that we see when we align political will with effective action, recognition of the problem, and enforcement alongside actually dealing with the real problem. We are working with Bangladeshi migrants who are the ones that are going to these factories who are being abused. When we work with the survivors and those most affected, as well as the governments, and put that kind of political pressure, then I think we can see change. But the type of change that we're going to have to see is going to continue that. It means more enforcement of the laws. It means other governments also enforcing these laws and not turning away their eyes. It also means the financial sector. Ultimately, who is financing these businesses that are responsible for carrying on forced labor? They have to also do the due diligence to see where that forced labor is in their investment portfolios, is in their supply chain. And I think as we strengthen all of those steps, we will see that the markets will respond, governments will respond, and we will have the potential for meaningful impact.
And maybe I'll give the rest of the panel to piggyback on that. You know, what approaches do you all believe are most successful in gaining government buy-ins in combating trafficking? I know that it's a source of shame for a lot of countries, including ours. It is hard to even have this conversation. I know that when we're in diplomatic settings, when we're visiting countries, it is hard to bring up the topic. So what, you know, I'm just curious, we'll start with Mr. Williams and come this way.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Building trust is essential, obviously, in this whole global response. And nothing really beats being on the ground and actually working collaboratively side by side, government officials, as they seek to as the first responders are seeking to address the issues, but also as government leaders are prioritizing budgets and setting infrastructural changes, to be actually there and investing time and resources alongside governments in a collaborative way builds that trust over time, and it does take time. I would say that on the macro scale, the TIP report itself is an incredibly valuable tool to prompt governments to look at their TIP response in a really, really directed way. It motivates change. It definitely drives policy decisions, action plans on the ground. So it can be a very powerful tool. It can be misused on the ground. It can be misunderstood, misinterpreted. Responses can be window dressing to try to get an upgrade. So it's important that there's that deep collaboration. At the same time, we have now, as Mr. Thier has mentioned, kind of the imposition of these trade bans through the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. So this also helps to direct attention to resources that government needs to actually strengthen its justice system response, and brings corporations into the conversation. So then you actually have large multinational corporations motivated in the same way as host governments can join up with civil society to respond, and you create these structures that actually develop sustainable change. So I think that's in brief, kind of some of the motivations that exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Omar, so for me, it would be three things. You know, and the number one, like Mr. William mentioned, is collaboration. We need to collaborate, especially with other countries. And as I mentioned, in particular countries in Africa, you know, we need big collaboration with that. And number two will be accountabilities. We need to start holding people accountable for the crime they commit. You know, there are cases, and I highlighted in my testimony on diplomats, you know, they need to be held accountable for bringing domestic servitude here, and we need to work, you know, on the visa when you're bringing a domestic, you know, worker to the U.S. And number three will be, you know, other countries should be encouraged to have survivors like me. You know, one thing I am very much grateful is the fact that the U.S. does allow us survivors to speak and to work on reports. I'm here talking to you guys. We're making changes. You know, we need to encourage other countries to have survivor leaders on board. You know, I was very grateful during the Obama administration to have 11 diverse survivors to be serve as advisory council to educate the administration on trafficking. I think that it would be great if we have other countries follow that suit. Thank you.
Evelyn said it better than anyone can, but I would say the moral leadership of survivors. I think that she's absolutely right that the United States has done this exceptionally well, and in great part because of what is penned in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And so would very much encourage that as a first step. The other thing I would say is I think we have to, as a movement, stop thinking of trafficking as a separate thing. Trafficking is the outcome of every other system failing. Right? It is the natural thing that happens because we are not protecting migrant workers, because we are not protecting refugees, because we are not protecting the most vulnerable among us. And so being able to think about trafficking interventions, both internationally as well as domestically, as a target in mind as opposed to a separate set of programs, I think is one way to go about helping other governments also understand that it doesn't need to be a different wing of an agency.
Did you have anything to add?
I forgot one last important thing.
Go ahead.
We need to stop separating the issue of sex and labor, because a lot of the times when you talk about combating human trafficking, the focus is always sex, and it hides away from victims, like me, myself, So separating the issue, I feel, causes more problem and hides the other issue. Human trafficking is labor and sex, but most of the times we only hear about sex trafficking.
Well, thank you all, and I now yield to Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Ms. Chumbow, you had mentioned in your testimony and talked about the impunity that you had faced during your 7 years of captivity, that nobody seemed to recognize. You were hiding in plain sight, so to speak. Then you did, I guess you initiated a prosecution. Who did you go to get that prosecution begun? And secondly, you also point out that while the trafficker went to prison, you never got the restitution. And where does that, why has that not happened? And maybe, Mr. Williams, you want to speak to that. I mean, we're talking about going the next step and making sure it's tax-free and all of that, but if the restitution never materializes in the first place, you're so disadvantaged and further hurt.
Thank you, Ranking Member Smith. I appreciate that, especially the part on restitution. Again, my trafficker was sentenced, and my case was in Maryland. Right. It was in Maryland, and when my case came to court, my trafficker was also known for embezzling money. And of course, this is the money, they took her money, the government took the money, but I was never given a restitution. And that happens a lot to victims, to survivors. They never really get their restitution. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we don't understand that, the education. Are we supposed to get the restitution? That's something that we need to strengthen when it comes to the restitution. Explain to us why we cannot get the restitution, because the order was there. And just to also give an example, not recently, I was very disappointed because my trafficker was out and I was never notified. And that scares a lot of victims to want to come out and testify or tell their story because they're not sure of their safety. If me, as a survivor leader, I'm out there, I'm speaking, and my trafficker was released from prison and I was never, informed, that really makes it very painful for a lot of victims to want to come and testify. But we definitely need to strengthen more laws when it comes to the restitution, because those restitutions do help us. I'm sorry, it probably would have helped me to pay off my student loan, So, because I did go to school and I'm still paying for that student loan, and we need to find better laws and ways to help enforce this restitution to be paid.
What triggered the prosecution? Was it a larger embezzlement issue, and then they found out you were being, and secondly, did you ever contact Polaris or any other, were you aware of the hotline that is available? Because they obviously connect law enforcement to, as well as to support services when somebody reaches out.
Oh, no, so I've been in this game for a long time, Rep. Smith. Okay, so my case came in the 90s. So back then, there wasn't a lot of laws.
Right.
You know,
No law.
I came to the U.S. in the early 90s, you know, and I got out of my situation at age 17, going on 19 in the early 2000s. So I went to a church, you know, and that's when I met with a priest and I shared my story. And from there, the church introduced, and it was Catholic Charity. You know, they didn't have hotline back then. I am one of the people that said, hey, we need numbers. We need a number to call. So it was so great that we finally got a hotline number. You know, I was one of the survivors that was advocating and having the hotline number. But back then, we didn't have that. You know, it was very difficult. So I went to a church, from the church, you know, law enforcement, and I believe my case, if I'm not mistaken, my case was probably the one to be investigated all the way back to Cameroon. You know, I shared my experience how I got here, and my trafficker, I believe, used one passport and brought 6 of us into the United States. So when we're talking about strengthening the borders and illegal immigrants, we definitely, because you cannot talk about trafficking without talking about immigration. You know, it's just there.
Thank you. Mr. Williams?
Thank you, Congressman Smith. Impunity can change very rapidly. Perpetrators are not brave or persistent in the trafficking world. If you increase your convictions, trafficking reduces. It's a simple equation. However, survivors need to be held at the center of that process. They need to be accompanied through that process. It needs to be survivor-friendly. And so the experience expressed by Ms. Chumbo is regrettable in that she wasn't communicated with about what was happening in her case. And that needs to change. There needs to be survivor-centered prosecutions. When that happens, you actually get substantial results in geographic locations. What I would say, secondly, about social protections and restitution, which you've mentioned several times, I agree with you, Congressman. This is very, very important. There's 2 points to know about restitution. The first is, this and other forms of social protection should never be contingent on participation in criminal proceedings. This is a separate matter. Someone who's a victim of trafficking is entitled to those social protections. We should lower the barriers to entry for this. It's not a criminal standard of proof that you need to get these social protections. And the best countries are the ones that have actually instituted survivor funds that can be accessed by those who are identified at an early stage as victims of trafficking, completely separate from the court process. That enables economic empowerment, it supports survivors through the journey, it shows them that the government's on their side, that they're there with them through the journey. Incredibly powerful, and I really do think that this is something that should be combined with the approach to survivor-centric prosecutions, but know that this is a separate thing. Survivors are entitled to these social protections regardless of their participation in criminal proceedings.
Mr. Williams, thanks for bringing that up, because when we did the original Trafficking Victims Protection Act, that was one of the key issues that held up its passage, including when we got into conference with the Senate. There were those who felt that there had to be a full-scale participation with the prosecutors, which I and others argued, you know, we want to put those, the bad guys, the purveyors, behind bars for as long as we could possibly get them behind bars, but not at the expense of the individual person who has been victimized. So a balance was worked out. It took a long time. It held up the conference for weeks. And we finally got it resolved that they needed to be helpful to prosecution. But frankly, I have always believed that we want to get these people away from further victimizing, so prosecution is key. But again, it should not be contingent on the victim being put at further risk of them coming back. So you're the one, I'm going to come after you, or re-traumatizing them as they go through the horrific details of what they have been through. So thank you for that. It is a very, very difficult balance. I believe we prevailed to a large extent, not fully, but there were some who wanted it to be, you know, quid pro quo. Participate in the prosecution or else there's the door. And that is not, in my opinion, humane. You know, I would ask you if you could, any of you have thoughts about what countries that are trending negatively, particularly those that are on the watch list that need very serious scrutiny about being dropped to Tier 3 during this next cycle, which obviously The TIP report will come out sometime in late spring, but I think it's not too soon to be putting countries on notice. And I say that also, you know, one of the more courageous things that George W. Bush did, he put two of our closest allies, Israel and South Korea, on Tier 3. And when he did it, you know, and of course, the sanctions part could inhibit military and other kinds of aid and cooperation between any country that's on Tier 3, as pursuant to the TVPA. And I met frequently with ambassadors from both of those countries during that year when they were worried about, well, what happens when the other shoe drops and the penalties are meted out. And they did amazing things to change the situation. The South Koreans passed new laws that looked a lot like ours, but they had some great ideas that they came up with that we could borrow from. And Israel, in like manner, began enforcing the huge numbers of women who were being sold into slavery in Tel Aviv and elsewhere, and got off Tier 3 the old-fashioned way. They earned it, as did South Korea. I'm one of those, and again, I'll ask the new administration as well, please don't pull your punches. You know, make sure you call it out, because for the victim who's being raped or forced into labor or whatever it might be, or both, because you're right, Ms. Chumbo, about it, very often the two are closely interrelated. They don't want to say, oh, that's an ally of the United States or not an ally. Who cares? Friends don't let friends commit human rights abuses. And we should be speaking out with equal fervor to both. And that has not happened. The worst time was in 2015 and 16, as I mentioned earlier, when the Reuters reporters said that they politicized the process. And frankly, there was bipartisan angst against that. I had 4 hearings on it. I was so angry about it. I said, please don't do that. What you do on the sanctions part is purely your prerogative, but what you do in speaking truth to power, again, should in no way be swayed by the political equation and who we want to curry favor with. So are there any countries in your views, or do you want to get back to us on that if you want to give it some further thought, that I happen to believe Vietnam should be dropped down to Tier 3, mostly because of labor trafficking? You know, without objection, I would ask the distinguished chair if she could include in the record Dr. Tong's testimony from Boat People SOS, who has testified before on these issues, as well as...
Without objection.
I appreciate that so much. As well as the CEO of the Anti-Trafficking International, Tanya Bien-Ami, Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, as well, as part of the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. But if there's any countries you think that we need to be really highlighting, you know, this far out, yes, Ms. Chumbo.
It's in my testimony. I would say Malawi. We mentioned, you know, countries like East Africa. So, because, yeah, Malawi would be one of the countries I think we should look into. And I know it's even in the TIP report this year, they mentioned Cameroon. You know, that was good, but I think they should follow the same suit when it comes to countries like Malawi.
Thank you, Congressman. The power of the TIP report, as you know, varies from region to region in the world. In Southeast Asia, I believe it is particularly powerful from my experience. And I note that there are a number of countries, you mentioned Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, and Thailand, all either at the watch list or the Tier 3 level. So there's really 2 things to note there. And first is the importance, as you've already alluded to, that the US government rely on the experts in the TIP office to drive the content of the report. And to, politicizing that process is going to discredit it. And we know this. So that's really the first thing, is to trust the experts in the TIP office. We've had a great relationship with them over many years, as you know, and they do fantastic work every year to collate these reports. And I do think it will have a powerful influence on the labor trafficking flows in Southeast Asia, and we hope to have a joined-up response between these countries. I would say one thing to note is whether the TIP office could consider limiting the practice of adding these extra exemption years, which keep countries on the Tier 2 watch list beyond what the intended timeframe is. Again, this goes to credibility in terms of the tool it is as a diplomatic tool to motivate change. And so if there are these continued extensions, that can harm the credibility, and that's a dynamic that we're seeing in some of these countries in Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Anybody else? Yes.
Thank you for the question. I don't have a specific country recommendation to give to you at this time, but I might list 2 or 3 things that we're very concerned about. One is, of course, around the pandemic impact and the pandemic recovery. One piece of work that we've been doing in Bangladesh has been looking at informal apparel factories, which is a relatively understudied problem. And one of the things that we have found is a much higher level of child labor in those factories than we had even anticipated based on the standards of the apparel industry at this time. And some of the reflection for that was because of children out of school, because of families who'd lost livelihoods, and we're deeply concerned about the increasing vulnerability of those families and the likelihoods that we're going to see increases. The second one, of course, is Afghanistan. There's been a lot of concern raised about the extent of outmigration of Afghanistan because of the Taliban takeover and lack of protections for very vulnerable migrants. And so we have a particular amount of concern about that now, just because the numbers have gone very rapidly through the roof. And so I think that looking at those places, also in East Africa, Ms. Chumbo also mentioned Libya, the rise of conflict, whether it's in Ethiopia, Libya, and other places, are creating a pressure on migration and outmigration that I think is creating increased vulnerability. And these are all situations that we're quite concerned about.
Let me just ask a question. You know, we often hear in the news that traffickers are streaming across our southern border. I've been to all the countries in Central and South, not all in South, but all in Central several times. We know that traffickers and cartels move women. We've had women from Mexico show up trafficked in my district. We've had women from Honduras show up trafficked in my district. This is not that recent, but we've had very serious problems. Usually it was affiliated with gangs. And these women were brought against their will. Thankfully, they were rescued and repatriated with their families. But I get concerned sometimes when, you know, kind of like a forced migration or a cartel bringing people over when they're paying, but it's not for sex or labor trafficking. It gets conflated with the term trafficking. We have written the TIP office and we've asked them, what is the situation on the ground? Are people, women and men, children, being trafficked in this huge flow that is making its way across the southern border? Do any of you have any insights as to what is happening there? I mean, there's so many unaccompanied minors. We know that they become easier prey for these predators. Do we have any data on this? We haven't gotten a word back from TIP on this, TIP office, I should say. But, you know, again, I don't care what the politics are. If children and women are being exploited into sex and labor trafficking, and they're using the cover of an open border to facilitate that, we need to be hard-nosed about it and very, very strong in protecting those innocent people from that cruel exploitation. Do you have anything on that, any of you? Ms. Chen.
Congressman Smith, thank you for raising this. You know, I actually went back in preparation for this conversation today to look at the data in the National Human Trafficking Hotline. At this point, we don't see an increase in trafficking specifically on the southern border.
Could I ask you, just as you answer that?
Yes.
How would those people coming across the border have any idea that there is a hotline, Polaris, for them to call?
And you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say there's of course a limitation, right, on reach. But I do want to raise again that the data that we do have is that so we went back and looked at 5 years of labor trafficking cases onto the hotline, 2015 to 2019. 87% of the labor trafficking victims came to the United States on legal temporary guest worker visas on the H-2A and H-2B, 87%. And so I recognize that, of course, there's a much larger or more complex conversation about immigration, but I do want to raise for this subcommittee that there is a solvable problem that we have, which is that we can actually end labor trafficking in the migrant guest worker system by re-regulating the H-2A and H-2B.
Okay, let me just one final comment I'd like to make, and I would like to express my gratitude to Department of State for making some critical important corrections to the 2021 TIP report. The Bangladesh section of the original publication was corrected from its statement that, quote, brothel owners forced them into sex work when they were children. As we all know, both under U.S. federal law and international law, any person under the age of 18 in the sex trade is a sex-trafficked child. As a matter of fact, if they're below 14, they can get up to life imprisonment if you do it. 18, it's 20 years or so, but I mean, that's how serious the crime is. And I think labeling the child sex trafficking as sex work normalizes abuse and the exploitation of children. To be clear, sex trafficking is not a job. It is exploitation, it's enslavement, and an attack on the dignity of the human person. And I would just conclude, when we passed the Frederick Douglass law a couple of years ago, again, with great input from A21 and all of you, as well as Frederick Douglass's great-great-grandson, Kenneth Morris, a big emphasis was on devising curricula that could be used in an age-appropriate manner for elementary, secondary schools, and even colleges, so that the signs could be noticed both by educators, administrators, teachers, and the students themselves. And that rollout was, in some degree, stymied by COVID. Obviously, people weren't going to school, but we're hoping that, and with the enhancement that is in our Karen Bass's and I new bill, that will roll out as quickly as humanly possible so that all of our young people are empowered to know what is lurking right around the corner for them or for their best friend or their acquaintances in school. I think we need to aggressively push this, not just here. I brought it to the attention of the OSCE and the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and got a resolution passed. I invited Frederick Douglass's great-great-grandson to come and do a presentation, along with a few other very talented people in the curricula area. And we had well over 100 lawmakers from Europe and Russia come to that, take the materials, and we're saying, do likewise. Protect your students and your young people from this exploitation. And I think knowledge is power, and that will help. So please help us get the bill passed, and thank you so very much for your leadership.
Well, thank you all for your incredible testimonies and for being so generous with your time. I want to thank Chairwoman Bass for convening this hearing and just express my gratitude to Ranking Member Smith for so passionately advocating on behalf of the world's most vulnerable people. It means a great deal. I think to your testimonies as we address human trafficking and the criminal aspects of it, we have to also think about holistically what it means for us to have humane immigration systems, what it means for us to be, siblings of one another and help countries that are economically struggling to invest in the education of young girls across the world so that they are not being exploited for the hopes of getting that education. And we have to critically address the conflicts that contribute, whether it's conflicts around resources because of the climate crisis, or the persistent conflicts that exist around terrorism and wars and fight around power in some of these countries that contributes to human trafficking, especially on the continent of Africa. And we have to address this with an intersectional lens. And understand that there are people who are vulnerable that we don't often get to see or acknowledge their humanity and dignity. So I thank you all and thank other committee members for their incredible questions today. And with that, the committee is adjourned.